I just want to deliver some breaking news to you that just came into our inbox. It's regarding the We Charity controversy. In particular, the headline is a very specific and simple one. We Charity is going to wind down its operations, according to a press release from the charity here in Canada. I'm just getting the press release, so I'll read alongside with you. It is with great sadness, it reads, that We Charity and its board of directors announced they are winding down the organization's operations in Canada. The organization will be selling its assets to establish an endowment fund to sustain the charity's existing international humanitarian programs and digitize its Canadian educational resources for long-term access. My understanding is that the Kielburger brothers will also step away from these operations. This is a really significant part, I guess you could say, of the controversy that has really engulfed Ottawa here for a number of months now. I'll just remind you of exactly what happened. There was a program that the federal government set up to give student volunteers compensation. We Charity was contracted to run that, kind of outsourced to run that program. And it became to light that there were ties between the Prime Minister's family and We Charity insofar as they were paid. Some members of his family were paid for speaking at We Charity events. I'm sure many of you have kids and you'll be familiar with We Day, for example. That led to a barrage of criticism for the federal government, and ultimately the deal broke apart and We Charity had to walk away and the federal government from the program. And since then, a number of committees have been studying the potential links between the federal government and in particular the Prime Minister's office or his family and the charity. We know from testimony from Craig and Mark Kielburger, who are the two founders of We Charity, that they had already suffered a lot of financial loss from the pandemic. They were being hit hard by what has happened during all of this. And as a result, it looks like the consequence is a very significant one for the charity. So just to update you, breaking news on the We Charity front, the founders of the charity have announced that they are going to wind down their operations here in Canada. My colleague, Catherine Cullen, I think has her microphone
yes.
on. Okay, she's good. She's good to go. So you're following this for us. I gave
yes.
just the headlines as it arrived in our mailbox, but can you sort of go over what exactly they detail in their press release?
So let's talk about a couple of the most pertinent parts of this statement. What We Charity is saying about why this is happening is obviously perhaps the most interesting part, Vashti, and I'm going to read from this letter that they've sent out. It says, COVID-19 significantly disrupted We Charity's programming. The fallout from the Canada Student Service Grant has placed the charity in the middle of political battles and misinformation that a charity is ill-equipped to fight. As a result, the financial math for the charity's future is clear. And that, of course, leads us to this winding down of Canadian operations. In fact, they open up this statement by saying, it is with great sadness that We Charity and its board of directors announced that they are winding down the organization's operations in Canada. The organization will be selling its assets. And of course, there's been much discussion about particularly the real estate that they own in the Toronto area. The organization will be selling its assets to establish an endowment fund to sustain the charity's existing international humanitarian programs and to digitize its Canadian educational resources for long-term access. So the takeaway, not the end of the We Charity internationally, and perhaps still some contribution, I guess, to Canadian schools, but certainly not the We Charity that has built itself up over the course of 25 years, that was regarded in many ways as an international success story, but of course more recently very much the subject of scandal with the Prime Minister's office.
So can we go over a little bit, I think for people who are watching, like I said, if you have kids, you know about We Days. We just got this, but they had a pretty extensive presence as far as a charity goes in this country. Like winding this operation down is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and I mean, as we have been exploring the story of the We Charity, its involvement in the Canada Student Service Grant, so much of this really, Vashti, as you know, has hinged on this question of how attached We Charity was to Canadian youth. They say they're in more than 7,000 Canadian schools. Now, there's been some reporting questioning precisely what does that involvement look like. But yes, certainly very involved. People know very well this concept of We Day, right? This sort of feeling of like a bit of almost like a rock concert. I always feel like I sound old when I say it that way, but a rock concert that the kids would go to that would get young people excited about the potential to be involved in their community, to reward young people who were involved in their community. But I guess the capabilities of the We Charity very much came under scrutiny over the course of this issue with the Canada Student Service Grant, right? The whole story really has hinged on this question of why they were chosen to be the third party that ran this government program, and just how much capability they had, not only in running the program, but how much their connection to Canadian youth stood up to scrutiny, to what extent they really were the only ones, because this is the argument that the Prime Minister has made, right? That the civil service told political officials, his office and others, that only the We Charity could do this job. They have a massive presence. They have been known. I mean, Craig Kielburger started this charity. Yes, he co-founded it with his brother, but he was something like 13 years old. And people who are old enough will remember him on 60 Minutes talking about ending child slave labor, essentially changing the world. The purpose of the We Charity, it used to be called Free the Children at that point, really has expanded over the years, right? So it went from ending forced labor for children to questions about what else could be done in order to help children. Well, it's not just enough to take them out of these jobs. We need to find schooling and get them access to health care. And then suddenly all the way manifesting itself to this idea of We Days and these sort of gatherings for students and curriculums here in Canadian schools.
And it's interesting because, you know, the focus on our show has very much been on the federal government and its decision-making process, and if what it has argued about this whole thing stood up to scrutiny. But there has been a whole other level of reporting, you know, done in other areas of the CBC and multiple other outlets on the charity itself. It's not something I'm an expert in, you know, I'll freely admit that, but certainly there have been a lot of questions about the way in which that charity was run. We know in some of the testimony, for example, the former director, the head of the board of directors, said that she resigned because she had asked for transparency around some of the layoffs they were making at the outset of the pandemic, and she couldn't get it, and so she left in March. So there's certainly, you know, there were a lot of questions to be answered, and clearly they were, you know, we saw many organizations like, I think it was TELUS and other sort of sponsors or partners step away.
And if you think fundamentally about what it is that We Charity did, because part of what Michelle Douglas was talking about was this question of the decision to let staff go, right? And that happened so early in the pandemic, and they were wondering what was going on. That's led to a lot of discussions about the We model and the financial model. Well, what does We fundamentally do? Yes, it does work in other countries, but it's the We Days, it's the We work in schools. And if suddenly you shut down schools and suddenly big gatherings are no longer a possibility, that makes making what We does very difficult. You add to that the concern about whether or not sponsors would be involved just because of the economic impacts of COVID. Heap on top of that all the questions about We's relationship with the government, the various practices at the charity itself, all these questions about how it's organized, right? The We Charity, the We Foundation, the various arms of it, how the board of directors was run. I mean, really the questions just did not end. And I think many charities in Canada, and when you speak to people in the charitable sector, I will say they will tell you that is very much the sad part of this story, is many charities hit so hard by COVID-19, like so many businesses, many that are struggling. And I know people who work in other nonprofit organizations who have said that they worry that one of the greatest impacts of this is going to be a loss of faith amongst some people, amongst some Canadians in the charitable sector at a time when they are already straining to function. We is obviously a very high-profile example of a charity that is no longer functioning, yes, because of COVID, but obviously the political circumstances and the degree of scrutiny they've received are an enormous part of this.
Let's talk a bit about the political circumstances because they persist. So there were a ton of questions prior to the shutdown of Parliament. Committees were taking a look at a lot of these issues. That's how we saw, we were just showing visuals of the Kielburger brothers testifying before the Finance Committee. The Finance Minister has resigned, you know, in part, however large that part, but in part to what happened here, Bill Morneau. This was a huge deal for the federal government. Parliament has been shut down right now until September 23rd, which means those committees, their work studying this comes to a halt as well. But we don't know what's going to happen when Parliament resumes. And we also do know that the Ethics Commissioner continues his investigation into the actions of the Prime Minister.
You say we don't know what's going to happen when Parliament resumes, and on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, we know absolutely that the other parties, particularly the Conservatives, are going to continue to glom onto this issue, because hitting the pause button on the investigations of that committee was ultimately just that. Yes, the prorogation of Parliament has very much shifted the discussion to whether or not it was appropriate to prorogue Parliament and what the implications are for COVID. But the fact that this, it seems, I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, but there are very serious questions about what the Prime Minister has done and whether or not there has been a conflict of interest. Obviously, he has already violated the Conflict of Interest Act in the past. If you are his political opponents and you smell blood in the water, what reason do you have to let that go? And we should say, as much as we've talked about the implications for charities, but we should talk about the other implication here, which is all the students who were actually supposed to be helped by the Canada Student Service Grant, right? I mean, summer's over, sorry to break it to everybody, and those students didn't get the particular help from this program that they hoped to see. So when you start lining up, if you'll forgive the expression, the casualties from this, I mean, you talk about the finance minister, you talk about all the students who didn't get the help that they need. To some extent, certainly we have to add We Charity to this. It really is incredible. And if we take ourselves back to the moment that this program was first announced in the spring, can you imagine who would have thought that of all the programs that have been rolled out during COVID, that this would in so many ways be the one to have the biggest repercussions? But then when you start scrutinizing a lot of what happened here, I mean, you talk about Bill Morneau. We both remember, I think, very clearly the moment in his testimony where he said, I'd like to let everyone know that I've written a $41,135 check, something to that effect. A very powerful moment politically, and obviously one that created quite a problem for him. Those were expenses, of course, that his family, that We Charity, that we incurred on behalf of his family. And Mr. Morneau said that he assumed that his family had paid all the expenses of these two particular trips and realized later that, oops, that wasn't the case. In fact, I realized it as I was preparing for this committee, so I have written a check that is, equivalent to some household income.
I think if we step back, it's fair to say, without the controversy, it'd be hard to imagine Bill Morneau resigning, and it'd be hard to imagine We Charity completely shutting down. I know there are many arguments it's putting forth about its viability because of the pandemic, but it hasn't seized all its international
Certainly,
operations.
and it too acknowledges, and let's just read that line again, and the fallout from the Canada Student Service Grant has placed the charity in the middle of political battles and misinformation that the charity is ill-equipped to fight. As a result, the financial math for the charity's future is clear. I mean, they are certainly saying the Canada Student Service Grant was part of this. As you rightly raised the point earlier, it led to a lot of scrutiny of the charity's behaviors, and so how much of that do the people inside the charity need to own? How much of this is circumstance? I don't think we're going to decide that right this moment.
And I think we're standing by trying to get the power panel up early so that they can react to this. You have to wonder where, Catherine, this goes from here. We talked about sort of politically that no doubt the opposition will desire to keep it alive. They accuse the government of shutting down Parliament in effect to stop scrutiny over this issue. There has been a lot less talk about We Charity in the past few weeks since Parliament ended to that point. But at the same time, that scrutiny will pick back up when Parliament resumes. And, it's hard to imagine that this doesn't sort of feed into another level of scrutiny.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wouldn't... While the point has been made that politicians in different parts of the political spectrum have been involved with We Charity in the past, of course, the relationship between the federal Liberals and particularly Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau and We Charity has come under particular scrutiny, of course, because Mr. Trudeau has family members, the Prime Minister, I should say, has family members who received money for speaking engagements with We Charity, and not small sums of money either. Perhaps his wife was a relatively small sum of money, but his mother and his brother were talking about quite substantial sums. That said, the Conservatives may not necessarily, I don't know what their feelings are about We Charity itself folding, but the fact that this brings the issue to the forefront again and reminds people, certainly that is going to be, it ignites this once again, and inevitably it was going to be ignited once again. As you say, the investigation of the ethics commissioner is certainly going to be another
it's an extra fire under it.
Point of emphasis in all of this, and I think we would expect to hear it, even the discussion around the throne speech, although there are ultimately bigger issues to talk about, the ethics of the governing party remains a significant one.
Do you mind sitting there for 1 second?
Not at all.
Well, I think I'm being told that a few, more than a few, maybe three of our power panelists are ready to jump in. Summa Strategies' Tim Powers, Kathleen Monk of Earnscliffe Strategy Group, and Sherelle Evelyn, I think if I'm right, managing editor of the Hill Times. Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you.
Okay, good. Tim, let me start with you. Just get your reaction on what is a pretty significant development in this controversy that we've spoken about so many times before.
Well, I don't think there's any joy in seeing any organization fold, particularly the people who work for them, who are now suffering, and the groups that they have helped. So you got to think of the personal side of it all. But I do still wonder if this is all because of the way this scandal has played out, if it is in fact the sole reason, and COVID-19. You'll recall Catherine was doing work on it. Many people were doing work on it. We Charity seemed to have some governance problems beforehand. Person of the board had resigned. So I think we have to learn more of the facts about what happened here today. But our first thoughts need to be with the people, and we need to get to the bottom of the story.
Kathleen, what do you think?
Well, it was a really quick fall in terms of an organization that really had existed for decades, I'm pretty sure. I recall when I was a young producer on another network, I remember booking Craig Kielburger on morning shows. So it's been around for decades. And then just to think that I was trying to think just before the producer called and said we were shifting in terms of focus, that really it was really since the end of June till now. It's been 3 months that this whole organization, everything has started to unravel. Certainly the program had been talked about in the spring, but how quickly the fall from grace. I'm with Tim, obviously. I'm worried both about obviously the individuals, but more importantly about the programs and impact that may have. I think it's important, though, to know that there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered about the WE program and about how the student grant program came to be. The opposition is still pressing for answers around Minister Chagger and when, in fact, her involvement in possibly promoting the WE Charity as an option. Obviously, we know that the prorogation of Parliament shut down several committees that were investigating this, and of course, the Ethics Commissioner is still doing that investigation as well. So I don't think the Liberal Party is clear of this conflict of interest yet in terms of the investigation. It will still continue. Whether this complete Canadian shutdown, as it's been described, will in some way dampen that fire that the opposition is pursuing, I don't know.
Catherine, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add something else from this statement, because Kathleen mentioned Craig Kielburger. We were talking about him earlier as this real, I mean, he is WE, right? He is Free the Children, the predecessor. And it does say in the statement, at the request of WE Charity's Board of Directors, WE Charity's Canadian staff, along with Craig and Mark Kielburger, will assist in the process of winding down operations. Once that is complete, all will transition from the organization. So this
hugely significant.
Enormous, because really, as Kathleen said, I mean, when we think about certainly Free the Children, which ultimately became WE, we think of that young Craig Kielburger, and to realize that it has come to this and that he's stepping away from what is left of his organization is pretty incredible, and his brother as well.
Yeah, Sherelle, so this isn't just a winding down of operations, it's also a winding down of their leadership role in this capacity, which is so concretely tied to the image, really, of WE in this country. And certainly it was a big part of the testimony and of how this controversy progressed through Parliament and through sort of political circles as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Kielburgers are we's the Kielburgers. I don't know if, I mean, obviously the problem and the issue for the government was the fact that they had sought that connection with especially the Trudeau family in booking Margaret Trudeau and Alexandre Trudeau to speak at so many events. You know, it brought that, if not in reality, that appearance that, you know, they were really rubbing shoulders with, like, you know, the movers and shakers in politics. You know, I believe in the cache of documents that was released to the committee, somebody described, you know, Morneau's office, or Bill Morneau, as being, you know, besties with them, even though they say they've never, you know, spoken or hung out socially. I mean, so there's all these ties, whether they're real or not, perceived or not. The damage was done, and it's really unfortunate that, you know, 25 years of work is ending this way. But you know, the government did themselves no favors, and the charity itself did itself no favors. If you look back at Canada Land's reporting from the last few years, it hasn't just been, I mean, months that this has, you know, kind of blood has been in the water for the WE Charity. It's been going back a few years where people have been sniffing around and saying, you know, there's something not quite up to scratch here that needs further investigation.
Okay, my understanding is that Amanda's connection is open now. Hi, Amanda. Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance. Glad that you're with us too. I wanted to get your take, and I know that this is, you know, gonna hit you in a personal respect as well. You just in in the effort of to be as transparent as possible. You've said often on the show when discussing this that you had a connection to this charity.
I did. Full disclosure, my charity, the charity that I founded, raised funds to support some of their international development work in the past. So I have been, closely tied to We Charities going on 10 years. And because of that, I do have a personal connection, and that connection has allowed me to see what they're capable of up close and personal, how strongly they were tied to kids in this country, how much they worked with kids to talk about programs like character building and social enterprise. They were in, as you know, thousands of schools, touched literally tens of thousands of lives. So this really is a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And to be clear, it's not the Liberal Party of Canada or the government who is the big loser in this. It's not the opposition parties. It's not politicians at all. It's all of the kids that will miss out on the incredible work that this charity has done. Were there questions? Yes, there were big questions, but the sniffing around that was referenced and the blood in the water, it's been going on for so many years. And what we find ourselves in is the shutdown, the complete devastating shutdown of a charity based on accusations. There hasn't been an investigation. There are likely issues that potentially could have been resolved, but now we find ourselves without having access to the benefit of that investigation, the benefit of a potential resolution. And the last thing I'll say is that, I think what they're talking about is the shutdown of the Canadian component.
It is specific.
This is a charity, right, that is in the US, in the UK, doing work internationally at a time when a lot of Canadian sponsors were pulling out of We Charity. American sponsors stood up and said that they would back them. So the writing was on the wall. This doesn't come as a huge surprise. I think when you fail to have the support and backing of the government, when you have really a trial without a jury, when you have a trial with public opinion the way that they have, and when you've been taken through the mud, at some point you're going to say, this just isn't possible for us to continue operation here.
Let me follow up with you quickly. Do you think that the federal government could have defended them more? Do you think? I take your point on the investigation.
I do.
Yeah. So what do you think about that?
I really do. And I think that what was tremendously sad, and we see it in all various forums, is that when an accusation gets momentum the way that these did, and when there are problems that become really public and without the benefit of an investigation, everybody pulls away because you don't want to be tied to this, negative story. You don't want to be pulled through the mud as well. And I think the government was at fault for doing that also. This was a government, a bureaucracy and a government who chose to put their faith in this organization based on the tremendous work that they did. And then when bleep hit the fan, nobody was there to stand up for them or to defend the reasons why. And I think that, it really is tragic, and really the losers are the kids who don't have the programs and the youth who didn't have the grants all summer long.
Tim wants to get in. I can see that. I can see it coming out.
Look, I respect what Amanda's saying, and she's right. I think the government could have helped them more, but there's also questions now that need to be asked about, if we're linking it back to where this all started for the We Charities, back to due diligence. Again, there was a tsunami, as Amanda rightly described, that had a significant damaging impact, but did people not foresee perhaps that this may have been a Hail Mary pass? Again, there was a lot that was written, and Sherelle referenced it, about challenges in the organization, challenges with governance, challenges with financial management. Again, taking aside the people who are losing the services of We today, the government, and bringing it back to what we're supposed to talk about, there does seem to be a failure of due diligence, and then that failure of due diligence perhaps compounded by what Amanda said. The government sunk everything in, and then when it got too hot, they abandoned them. It's all very unfortunate, but more work needs to be done here to see if that was ever a wise choice. Never mind the political choice, but did this organization have the capacity, have the governance capability to have administered that program? Another potential error that wasn't examined.
Yeah, that is part of what was being studied, Kathleen, by the committees, right? To a certain degree. It's just that it became one question among many, and many of those other ones were very, politically charged. So it just, a lot of it became lumped in together. But to Tim and Amanda's point, I guess, you have to think it is interesting to see the trajectory of it, right? Like how quickly, I think you were saying, right? It's only 3 months. Yeah, it's only 3 months.
Yeah, we do have to remember, though, that we did actually hear substantive testimony. We heard from executive leadership. We heard from former board members who were key parts of the organization for many years. We heard from political elected officials. We heard also from political staff. And more importantly, we also heard from the public servants as well at a high level. So we had that information. And Tim makes a valid point that the government was the one who pulled the plug on these committees, right? If we hadn't prorogued, the committees would still be doing that work right now. So if Amanda's feeling is that they could have maybe defended the organization more, that was a choice on the Liberal government's behalf, not to go to the wall on that, not to let those committees breathe. They'll still come back. The ethics commissioner will still do the work that needs to be done, but that could have been another option. I think that in some ways, truthfully, the Canadian domestic closure of WE is a bit of a gift for the Liberals. It does, I think, dampen the fire. I think it presents an opportunity for a bit of a cleaner pivot to the restart, the refresh of the government with the speech from the throne that will come in just 2 weeks from now. I think it provides a small modicum of closure.
I wonder.
Although, as I said, there's still lots of questions.
Yeah.
The minister's behavior.
I wonder, Catherine, because as I said to you before, I sort of, I'm not an expert in We Charity and how it governs itself, but I did study very closely, and as does the press gallery, the actions of the federal government in this. And that's where my attention was, and I imagine that those questions will persist, right? Because those central questions around, were they the only ones who could do this? Were they equipped? I mean, that kind of all falls back on the government.
Well, and I think the point Kathleen was making was very interesting, and I will not try to prognosticate and say that this does or doesn't make it easier on the government. I guess the counter argument that I would weigh to that and I would wonder about is, alternatively, does some of this fall at the feet of the government, right? I mean, do they bear a part in ultimately what happened to We Charity, and does that in some ways add to the pressure around it? As you say, it certainly is what we shamelessly call a news peg, right? Like there is news here, and thus we are talking about we again, and that is not certainly in the government's interest, and it will certainly provoke members of the opposition into talking about we again. Not that they were ready to give up on this issue at all, but it is a renewed moment to discuss what has happened here. Where does this go in the long run? How does it interplay with discussions around the speech from the throne, the ethics commissioner's investigation? I said at the beginning of this I wasn't going to prognosticate, and I'm not going to.
Yeah, it does certainly, to everyone's point, Sherelle, underscore, I just keep thinking now, in each iteration of this, we talked about how first it was just sort of a discussion with the power panel, and then the committee started studying it, and then Bill Morneau resigned. And I know that there are other reasons as part and parcel of that, but I don't know if he would have if it weren't for this controversy. And now a charity, which, yes, was facing a lot of very genuine questions, but also did have a big track record in this country, and certainly had a big presence, I should say, in this country, is completely winding down its operation. Those founders are leaving their roles. This is no longer just, sort of a story that the media made up for a few days and then it died.
Yeah, no, it's definitely become its own thing, its own entity, its own monster, I guess you could call it. It wasn't going away, even though Parliament was prorogued. I mean, it was only maybe last week, time has no meaning anymore, but maybe it was last week, a couple weeks ago, that the Conservatives' critics were writing, still pushing and asking We Charity for their data, for information about speaking fees paid to the Trudeau family. They were still pushing. Letters being written to the official languages commissioner, asking for more investigations into the contract and the charity's ability to fill it and whether the government did its job. So it wasn't going away, and the government is not going. And I think with the We Charity winding down its Canadian operations, I think it gives the opposition potentially another cudgel to say, well, look, another one bites the dust, whether it's the finance minister, now the Kielburgers themselves, people in opposition, the Bloc and the NDP have been calling for resignations among like Chief of Staff Katie Telford, Youth Diversity Inclusion Minister Barty Jagger, everybody saying, falling at the feet of the Prime Minister, kind of taking the fall and going under the bus for him and saying, this is just one more example of the Prime Minister getting away with something where he should be held accountable.
Amanda, if I could ask you, I know that you obviously take to heart the consequences of the charity folding, but from a political perspective, what do you think it does to the issue in particular where the Liberals and the opposition are concerned?
I mean, I don't think in any way this stems the bleed. I don't think that this is that one moment where the charity folds and, we put this story to rest. I think in many cases, I agree with whomever said that in some ways it puts it back at the feet of the government. It's another casualty from this controversy. And I think that, no matter how you might feel about We Charity, there's something to be said to the decades-long work that they did in this country, to the fact that they were in thousands of schools, working with tens of thousands of students in a positive way for a very long time. So I think that there are parents who will be up in arms in a renewed and fresh way, and they'll be looking to place the blame somewhere. So how does the government navigate it? Because what we were scrutinizing was one program, one grant, an enormous one, and the due diligence that went with that. And the fallout of it has been so tremendous. And whether you bundle Bill Morneau into that, you certainly have to bundle this charity into it, because it was directly there. The decimation of this charity is directly tied to the fallout of that program. So I think that the interest and how that interest spreads, if you weren't politically interested before, you may still be interested from the perspective of being a parent and wanting your kids to have access to these programs that no longer exist in Canada. And that means that a whole new audience is now paying attention to the story.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate you rescheduling everything to jump on and react to the news. Thanks to our power panel this evening, Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, Kathleen Monk, and Sherelle Evelyn. My colleague Hannah Thibodeau has been following this story. She actually spoke with somebody who is an employee of the charity about how this all went down. What did they tell you, Hannah?
Yeah, so we got the news later today, but employees were informed of this a couple of hours before it broke. What they were told is that there was going to be a conference call, and it was actually a video chat. So it was a couple of hours before this employee said that it actually made it to the media, that they were informed about this. And what they were told on this conference call, which included video conference call, which included the two Kielburger brothers, both Mark and Craig, but also this person believed there were quite a few others from the whole Canadian contingent of We involved in this video conference. There were a lot of people on the call, we're told. They were told that they didn't really have a lot of information. However, they wanted to give the workers a heads up before it made it out to the media. This person said that it was very disheartening, and they'd been working for the We Charity for about 6 months or so, and it has been a crazy 6 months, of course, because of everything that has been happening. So the conference call happened this afternoon. It was about an hour long with the Kielburger brothers as well as others, and they were told that they had to do this. They had to wind down the Canadian operations in order to keep overseas operations going. So this was the reason that the workers were given in this hour-long video chat. I asked what the Kielburger brothers, what was their impression of the Kielburgers when they were giving this information. They said they didn't really see too much of that. However, what they did say is that it was a very sad atmosphere. Of course, a lot of people are employed by We Charity. Also, people were getting choked up during this video conference. So this was one worker who is involved with the We Charity. They were given the heads up before it reached out to the media that they were going to wind down the Canadian operations, and said that there were a lot of choked up people on that video conference call.
Any word from them about like how is this just immediately done, everything's over, or is there sort of a wind down plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this person said that they are still employed, that it is going to take a while still for the operations to completely wind down. I said, how long do you expect to be employed there? They said that they still expect to be employed for a while. They think that there will be another video chat as of next week to give more of that type of information because they don't know how long they will still be employed there. They felt it could be a couple weeks to a month to wind all the operations down, and they'll be a part of that wind down. But then also they said they weren't getting a lot of information about those type of details at this point, that those type of details would come later in another video chat.
Okay, good to know. Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate all that information. The CBC's Hannah Thibodeau with that update. I want to bring in now Kate Bain. She's the managing director at Charity Intelligence, I think it is. Pardon me, Charity Intelligence. Kate joins us from Toronto. Good to see you again. Thanks for making some time for us.
Good to see you, Rafi.
So we spoke, Kate, not so long ago when this was really quite a live issue here on Parliament Hill, and you gave us some more information because our focus has been the politics of this on the charity itself. Does this decision today, based on what you know about how this charity operated and what this controversy has done to the charity, does it surprise you at all?
Yes, totally. We Charity, this whole event has surprised us, and today's news no less. Very shocking news. And just really trying to put the story together, understand all the different threads. There are different statements, there are different news stories. And I find that with We Charity, you really have to read the sort of fine print to understand, what is going on and what is the plan. Because at the end of the day, this is a Canadian charity. And its support, its real estate assets have been paid for and tax receipted by Canadian donors. So there are clear laws and regulations that those assets can't just be picked up and taken off to Kenya. So I really want to see how this is, carefully gone through, and to make sure that Canadian donor rights are protected.
Yeah, what are your main questions? Like, what exactly are you worried about, and what answers are you lacking right now?
Well, just apparently the UK operations are going to remain open, which is different from what we might have heard before. The American operations are going to continue. And this was because of COVID-19 that significantly disrupted operations. If COVID-19 disrupted the operations in Canada, they didn't disrupt the operations in America, which I have a question about. And it is the American operations that is one of the largest revenue sources for We Charity. It was We Charity in the US where we have, huge amounts of money coming into Canada from that. But that's going to continue on. On the real estate properties, We Charity has $39.4 million in Canadian real estate, and that is now going to be sold. Mm-hmm. And the proceeds from that real estate are apparently going to be put into a separate We Charity Foundation endowment fund.
Yeah, let me just interrupt you for 1 second, just so that our viewers can keep up here. I'll read to them exactly and you the exact part of the statement that you're referring to. The endowment fund will be created by selling the assets of We Charity Canada, including the We Global Learning Centre. The organization will also sell nearby properties acquired as part of a capital campaign to support the organization's 25th anniversary, Campus for Good, a redevelopment initiative to provide free space to incubate under 35 change makers. So there have been a lot of stories reporting on the sheer amount of real estate that this charity owned, particularly in one area of Toronto. I imagine this is in reference to that, but what are your questions about, for example, that creation of an endowment fund?
Well, an endowment fund is normally done by a donor when a donor wants to set up a legacy. And these real estate assets are Canadian assets. They have been tax receipted. They belong to the Canadian public. So how they are then moved into an endowment fund to go to a different charitable purpose is very interesting to me. And I'm not quite sure how donors' rights are going to be protected. If a donor made a $15 million donation to We Charity to build that global learning center, now that asset's going to be sold, and those funds are going to go to Kenya. I'm not quite sure how donors' rights are going to be protected as this We Charity is unwound, because there are a lot of regulations on that.
You said off the top that you were surprised. You are as familiar as anyone with the kind of scrutiny that the charity was facing, that the kind of reporting and questions that have been raised, particularly since the controversy broke here in Ottawa about its practices, its conduct. You and I spoke about last time that testimony from the former head of the board of directors, who said that she couldn't even get the transparency she had asked of the executives of the charity. Why is it that you were still surprised? Is it because the magnitude of the closure, the magnitude of its presence in Canada prior to this announcement?
Here's a charity that's in a tight situation with COVID and with an investigation. We have seen other charities go through similar scandals. Oxfam, Canadian Red Cross, they didn't just close up shop. So this decision to shut down when there are so many questions still going on is very surprising. I would say unprecedented. And there are a lot of questions going on. And what's going to happen to those questions now? Does the Canada Revenue Agency, the Charities Directorate, still have the right to investigate? Or is it that no, this is now shut down and there's no investigation? It really is going to put the ball into the New York Attorney General's court, because these U.S. We charities are registered in the U.S. And I must say, I'm very impressed. She's done a fantastic job looking into the NRA. And so that they are taking a much more forceful look at charitable operations.
If it surprises you, I guess, if all that you laid, based on all that you laid out, what do you think is driving it? Like, what do you think is behind it?
I've got concerns there. It would seem that Canadian donors, I just want to make sure that when you have a wind-up of a charity, that Canadian donors' rights are protected, and that the assets that have been tax receipted by the Canadian government are going to be held for charitable purposes. When we look at this We situation, the government was lucky. It got its $30 million back. What about all the Canadian donors who have put, tens of millions of dollars into We Charity over the years into its Canadian operations? How are those donor rights going to be affected in this wind-up?
Kate, before I let you go, the one other portion of this certainly stood out to me, and I did want to get your reaction. At the request of We Charity's Board of Directors, the statement reads, We Charity's Canadian staff, along with Craig and Mark Kielburger, will assist in the process of winding down We Charity Canadian operations. Once that is complete, all will transition from the organization. So Mark and Craig Kielburger, the founders, they are we is the Kielburger brothers, are leaving. How significant is that from your perspective?
I've read different stories on that. I've heard that Mark and Craig are stepping down as volunteers with We Charity. And then I read the press release, and they are going to be involved in the dissolution of We Charity, yes. And they are going to be involved in the establishment of the new charity. So many questions there. Will the directors of the new We Charity Foundation, that's going to be the endowment, will they have access to financial transparency? Will they be independent of the co-founders, or will they be selected and answerable to the co-founders? So many questions that could be in the fine print that we will just have to wait and see if we get disclosure on.
For sure. Lots more questions, you're right, than answers at this point. Thanks so much, Kate. Appreciate your time and insights.
You're welcome.
Kate Bain is the managing director at Charity Intelligence. Certainly, you would expect that this announcement from We Charity ignites the discussion around the federal government's involvement, the decision-making process, and certainly how opposition parties plan to scrutinize what has happened. To get more on that angle of this story, I'm joined now by the leader of the New Democratic Party, Jagmeet Singh. Hi, Mr. Singh. Good to see you as always.
Very good to see you, Ms. Capellos.
Were you surprised to hear this announcement from We Charity?
Well, what I think this announcement does is just really highlight the fact that as we had believed that the organization needed financial support that the Liberal government were helping out friends, those closely affiliated, or an organization that had helped them, they were helping out themselves. And in doing so, the fact that the organization was on the brink financially really just redoubles the effort, or just strengthens the argument that they were in a financial desperate situation, which the Liberal government was trying to bail them out of.
Okay, I have to ask you to sort of, I guess, explain that, because I take your point that this obviously shows they were in financial trouble, but we don't really have any proof that that means that that doesn't prove for sure that the federal government was just trying to bail them out of that problem, does it?
Well, it strengthens the argument if there's some evidence now that suggests that they were, in fact, in a difficult financial situation, and now they've had to shut down. Really, what this scandal is about is the fact that the Liberal government made claims that this was about helping students when there were many ways to help students. It was never about that. And as the evidence came out, it turned out that the minister involved was not completely forthright about the relationship between the Liberal government and this organization. It turns out there was information given that pretty much set up the only answer that the public sector could come back with was we. So there's questions around that impartiality, the fact that it was not there. Really what's happened here is the Liberal government tried to help out an organization closely aligned or had been benefiting the Liberal government. And now that organization is shutting down. And at the end of the day, students are the ones that are struggling because this Liberal government could not come up with some clear ways to help them out, by increasing the grants, by helping students with debt, by increasing the Canada Summer Jobs Program. All simple, straightforward ways that would have helped out students in a meaningful way.
I take your point. I think it's important to note that students for sure were the ones who would have been impacted by this program and therefore are impacted by what has unfolded. I also take your point, I think, on questions for ministers based on the documents that we've seen so far and various politicians about their involvement. I would add, though, that lots of those documents, and I've combed through them like you have in the weeks since they were delivered to the Finance Committee, also underscore that the government, that the public service was the ones saying to the government, this would be a good decision. Like, that communication does exist as well.
Right, but that communication is really put into question when documents have come to light that the Minister Verdees Jugger, actually provided essentially all the criteria, and the criteria was specifically designed in a way that would only make we the answer. So it was not really a genuinely impartial, tell us who could do this. There was communication that set up we to be the answer. So really, that in and of itself, that the suggestion that it was an impartial decision by the public sector, that's also put into question with the documents. Really, the Liberal government tried to help themselves out and help out those closely aligned with them, and people have been the one that have paid the price. And at the end of the day, the Liberal government shut down Parliament, pretty much ending any way for us to put forward legislation to help Canadians out who are looking at their CERB ending at the end of September, and no clear plan in place for them to have supports, those who can't go back to work, those who've been impacted by sectors that are not yet able to open up. There are a lot of Canadians that are hurting, and Prime Minister Trudeau shut down Parliament and has delayed any opportunity for us to bring forward new legislation, again, hurting Canadians.
And for sure, I'm guessing we're going to have a lot of conversations about that over the next few days. Certainly, I know that the government, as far as the CERB ending, says that they don't need legislation to move people onto EI, but we know they do need legislation to move people or to create a new benefit, essentially, for people who are relying on CERB right now but don't qualify for EI. So there are, questions for them about how that will work when Parliament resumes. But certainly they say the majority, I think it's 3/4 of the people on CERB who will continue to need it, will be able to move on to EI. Just back to the charity, the We Charity stuff, and in particular, now that Parliament, you talk about Parliament being prorogued and the committees that were working on this, were studying this issue, also being shut down. I saw a tweet from your counterpart in the Conservative Party, Aaron O'Toole, who said, we needs to make sure that they deliver all the documents that they had promised, for example, the Finance Committee, even though they're winding stuff down. Is that a call that you echo? Are you worried about getting, a challenge, about getting any kind of challenge getting those documents?
There shouldn't be, and that's an important call that despite the fact that we is shutting down, it doesn't change the fact that the Liberal government needs to answer a lot of questions, how this happened. The minister has to answer questions of why her statements were contradictory. that she had said one thing to committee, but documents show something very different. These are things that still need to be answered. These are questions that Canadians want to see answered. And the documents that have been requested should certainly be provided to committee when committee is struck again.
Do you anticipate that these studies will resume in full?
They should resume in fall. I think that's the appropriate thing to do. There were still numerous witnesses that were still scheduled to come forward, and there is still the documents that had been released just as the committee was being shut down. So questions arising from the documents have not been asked yet. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Any discussions between yourselves or members of your party and other parties about how that will happen when Parliament resumes? How or if, I should say?
There have not been discussions about that, but once committees are struck as Parliament is reconvened, this would be a process that can happen in a committee where a motion is brought forward to restart these discussions.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Singh. I really appreciate you making time for us on such short notice tonight.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Jagmeet Singh, he's the leader of the federal New Democratic Party. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.